The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the ocean as the Coast Guard patrol boat cut through the water with a confident hum. It was supposed to be a routine inspection run, nothing out of the ordinary. The crew, a mix of seasoned officers and cocky newcomers, moved with the kind of rhythm that comes from repetition. They had done this dozens of times before. Search. Sweep. Question. Remove if needed. Business as usual. It was during one of those sweeps, near a sleepy harbor known more for fishing boats than smugglers, that they spotted him. He wasn't hiding, not exactly. He sat calmly near the back of a vessel docked off the main pier. A quiet man in dark clothing, slightly disheveled, watching the water like he'd been at sea for days. He didn't look like a threat, but he didn't look like he belonged either. To the junior officers, he was an easy mark. No visible ID, no uniform, and no attempt to explain himself. When they called out to him, he stood slowly, almost too slowly, like he was measuring the moment. His calm seemed to irritate them. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just stood there with this strange stillness in his eyes, like the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much. They asked him questions, quick and sharp. Who are you? Why are you here? Whose boat is this? His answers were short, polite, but not enough to satisfy their growing suspicion. The senior officer on deck stepped in, impatient, trying to assert control. When the man didn't offer credentials immediately, the decision was made without hesitation. Get him off the boat. Escort him back to the dock. Let the port authorities deal with him. They didn't check his pockets. They didn't ask for ID again. One of the officers even laughed, calling him a dock squatter and nudging him with the butt of his clipboard. The man stepped off the vessel without resistance. No one noticed the slight limp in his gait, the kind that suggested an old injury, possibly from a life lived in danger. No one noticed the military-grade boots, scuffed and worn from years of real use. As they turned back to their patrol, they radioed the incident in casually. Just another unauthorized loiterer. No threat, no paperwork, no big deal. But the dock manager, an older man with sea-gray eyes and a deep knowledge of who came through his port, raised an eyebrow when he saw the man walking toward the benches. Something didn't sit right. He approached the Coast Guard crew with quiet authority. Asked a simple question. Did they get his name? They shrugged it off. Just another drifter, they said. But something about the man's presence lingered. The dock manager walked over, asked the man directly for identification. The man hesitated briefly, as if debating whether it was even worth the trouble. Then he pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket, handed over a military ID card tucked behind a service ribbon. It took only seconds. The name on the card, the branch, the rank. It didn't match the appearance of a drifter or a squatter. It matched the records of someone with decades of classified operations in deep-sea rescue. It matched the file of a man once pulled out of retirement by direct order of command. Back on the patrol boat, the senior officer's radio crackled. The voice on the other end wasn't yelling, but there was urgency in the tone. You need to check that ID. The officer raised an eyebrow, annoyed. But then the dock manager's name came through again, this time with emphasis. He opened the digital registry, typed the name they were given. The screen loaded slowly, then froze, then returned with full clearance tags across multiple branches, along with words no junior officer ever wants to see. Restricted. Do not engage without authorization. Silence fell over the deck. The men who had just laughed and shrugged now exchanged nervous glances. The commanding officer clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the edge of the console. The rest of the crew waited, unsure what to say. They had kicked him off like he was nothing, like he didn't matter. And now the name on that ID was reshaping everything they thought they knew about who he was. The man stood at the edge of the dock, the ocean wind tugging at his jacket, salt clinging to his skin like an old memory. He was still, like a statue carved from years of hardship. No patches, no rank, no insignia. To the outside world, he looked like a nobody. Someone washed up, maybe unemployed, maybe even homeless. That's all the Coast Guard officers saw. A man in civilian clothes with a distant stare, no explanation, and no urgency to prove himself. But what they failed to see was the way he stood. There's a certain posture that doesn't come from arrogance, but from experience, the way a person holds their body when they've stood in front of chaos and walked out alive. He didn't puff out his chest or square his shoulders to intimidate. He simply stood like he'd been standing his entire life in the face of storms much greater than this one. His clothing was plain, but his boots were military issue. Not the kind you buy at an army surplus store, but the kind issued to specific task forces, ones that train beneath the radar. They were worn but clean, like he still respected them enough to keep them maintained. The officers, however, weren't trained to look at boots. They were trained to look at badges. And he wore none. One of the younger Coast Guard members smirked, nudged the guy next to him, and whispered something under his breath. The others chuckled. Another guy pretending he's been somewhere, someone muttered. The man didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He simply kept watching the waves roll in like they were speaking a language only he understood. They tried to provoke a reaction. A little sarcasm here, a shove there. But he remained calm. Not submissive, just unfazed. That calmness should have been the first clue. It was too deep, too practiced. The kind of stillness you only find in people who've seen the worst and made peace with it. He answered their questions with minimal words. No complaints. No anger. He called the officer sir even as they ridiculed him. One of them leaned in and said, "If you're supposed to be somebody, where's your uniform?" The man didn't reply. But his eyes, steady and sharp, seemed to look past the officer like he could see something none of them could. That look made one of the senior crew shift uncomfortably. He recognized something in those eyes. Not fear. Not submission. But history. A shadow of someone who had once been in the thick of it, someone who had worn a uniform not for the paycheck or the praise, but because it was a calling. But even with that gut instinct whispering something wasn't right, the senior officer brushed it aside. They told him he had no authority to be on the boat. That without identification or clearance, he was trespassing. He nodded, didn't argue, and simply stepped aside when ordered. But it was the way he moved, deliberate, precise, that set him apart. There was no wasted motion, no stumbling. Every step he took looked like muscle memory trained from years of drills. Even off the boat, sitting quietly on a weather-worn bench near the edge of the dock, he didn't slouch or fidget. He sat with his back straight, hands folded, eyes scanning the water. Not paranoid, alert. A kind of readiness that never really leaves the body. The officers went back to their duties, mocking him under their breath, passing glances of amusement, confident they'd done their job. They never noticed the scar behind his ear, barely visible, the kind that comes from underwater demolition or tactical gear wear. They never saw the faded outline of a tattoo near his wrist, partially obscured by his sleeve, the sort that used to be given only to members of an elite rescue unit that no longer officially existed. They were too focused on the surface. And on the surface he gave them nothing. No threats. No explanations. No warnings. Just a quiet presence that held more weight than they understood. He didn't demand respect because men like him never need to. But even in silence, his posture spoke volumes about the battles he'd fought, the lives he'd pulled from death, and the weight of the uniform he no longer wore but never truly took off. The Coast Guard officer tapped his pen against the clipboard, annoyed. The report from the dockmaster had come in with urgency, pushing this quiet man back onto their radar. It wasn't protocol to check ID after removal, especially not when they were convinced he posed no threat. Still, something about the dockmaster's insistence unsettled the senior officer. With a huff, he motioned to the junior officer beside him to pull up the database and run a name check. But then the officer realized no one had even asked for his name. Not properly. Not respectfully. Just barked questions and shoved him along. Now curiosity mixed with pressure. One of the officers stepped off the boat and approached the man who was still sitting calmly on the bench like nothing had changed. "We're going to need to see some ID," he said, less forcefully this time. The man didn't respond right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket slowly, carefully, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. There was nothing flashy about it. No challenge in his expression. Just a quiet resignation, like he'd seen this scene play out before. He handed over a single card. Military issue. Laminated. No expiration date. On it was a name, simple, unassuming. But to anyone who had ever served in classified operations or high-risk maritime rescue, it was more than a name. It was a legend. The officer stared at the card, his fingers suddenly tighter around the edge. A small silence followed. Then the officer cleared his throat, unsure what to say. He passed it up the chain. The senior officer took one glance and narrowed his eyes, as if he didn't trust what he was seeing. He pulled out his tablet. opened a secure verification portal, and began entering the ID number. The system didn't respond the way it usually did. There was no automatic confirmation. Instead, it froze briefly, before loading a message in red text, "Clearance required." He tried again using a higher-level login. The screen flickered, then revealed a classified record, partially redacted, but enough was visible. A list of commendations, operations that weren't supposed to exist. A record of a diver assigned to critical underwater missions in hostile zones. A service member tied to international recovery efforts that saved not just American lives, but the lives of foreign allies as well. Some of the missions had no names, only numbers. Some had commendation letters signed by figures far above their pay grade. The room felt colder suddenly. The officers leaned in, reading what they could, the smirks fading from their faces. This wasn't just some retired Navy guy with stories. This was someone who'd been in places no one spoke about. The kind of man whose presence was logged by time, not location, because where he went wasn't always meant to be tracked. Then someone noticed the seal at the corner of the ID. It wasn't a standard Coast Guard emblem. It was a modified insignia layered with symbols of joint task forces and recovery divisions most people had never even heard of. At the bottom, next to his name, was a rank. Not a high one in appearance, but it was followed by a code that denoted classified clearance. Not just active duty clearance, deep ops. Operative level. Access that required renewal every 3 months, tested under psychological pressure, background check to a level that most government agents never reached. Someone whispered the name aloud. Another officer across the room looked up. Wait, that's him. The silence that followed wasn't out of respect. It was realization. The man they had mocked and removed from their vessel wasn't a nobody. He wasn't even just a veteran. He was the kind of asset that gets summoned only when things go catastrophically wrong. The kind of name that shows up in after-action reports but never in the media. The officer who had laughed earlier now looked pale. He remembered reading a story during training about a deep-sea recovery that saved an entire submarine crew, written up in a training manual as a case study in impossible rescue. The name listed in the footnotes was the same one now staring back at them from the ID. None of them had asked. None of them had looked closely. They assumed. They saw the surface and never once considered what lay beneath. And now, the man they'd dismissed so easily had become the center of a quiet storm unraveling among their ranks. A name that carried weight. A name that demanded answers. A name they now wished they had never ignored. Word spread faster than anyone expected. It began with a single voice crackling over the Coast Guard's encrypted radio, a low, uncertain tone, asking if someone could confirm the name on a high-clearance ID that had just been verified. The response wasn't immediate, but within minutes, other units started replying. Some brief, some silent, with only a double-clicked mic in acknowledgement. The kind of clicks used when words weren't enough. Within the hour, the weight of that name echoed through the entire chain of command like a cold front rolling in over still waters. Inside the control room of the patrol boat, a growing sense of tension hung in the air. One of the senior officers leaned against the console, reading the classified file over and over again, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Another officer, who had earlier cracked jokes at the man's expense, now stood completely still. He had seen the list of operations linked to the name. He didn't recognize all of them. Many were blacked out or listed only by code, but one entry stood out. It was a rescue mission conducted in Arctic waters, under hostile threat, where a joint force submersible had malfunctioned, leaving 6 lives at the mercy of freezing darkness. The man they'd removed had led that operation, alone, and brought everyone back. There was no official press on it. No medals pinned on national television. Just internal records and letters of classified commendation from international security councils and defense departments. The deeper they read into the man's record, the more the silence grew. They began to realize the scope of what he'd done and what he'd chosen not to reveal. Someone in the room pulled out his phone and typed the name into a private veteran forum. The first reply came back in all caps: "If it's really him, tell him salute from Team 9 Delta." Then another: "That man once swam through a collapsed oil rig pipeline to rescue divers stuck with 30 minutes of oxygen left." Another message followed. He's the reason a dozen Gold Star families didn't have to bury their sons. Testimonies kept pouring in, not from the press, not from politicians, but from men who had fought beside him in silence, men who knew what he'd done because they were there to see it. A junior officer, still holding the laminated ID with gloved hands, whispered, "Why didn't he say anything?" The room had no answer. Because men like him don't speak for praise. They speak when lives are on the line. And when the mission is done, they walk away. No press conferences. No memoirs. No Instagram reels. Just service. By now, officers at regional command were requesting a direct line with the man. There was a quiet urgency, not to interrogate him, but to check in. Make sure he wasn't in distress. Men like him don't just show up at ports without reason. And if he was there, sitting silently, it probably meant something was already in motion. One of the higher-ups made a private call to a retired admiral who had once overseen covert naval operations. The admiral's voice, sharp even in retirement, stiffened when the name was mentioned. "Tell them not to lay a hand on him," he said. "And tell your men they're lucky he didn't walk away without showing anything at all." The silence turned to embarrassment. No one on that patrol boat had expected this. No one had thought that the quiet man sitting on the bench was someone whose actions had rippled through the most classified circles of maritime security. He didn't look the part because he had long outgrown it. He had gone deeper, seen more, done what others wouldn't, and came back carrying stories he would never tell. The irony didn't escape them. They were trained to assess threats, detect danger, recognize heroes. And yet, the one man who had likely saved more lives than their entire unit combined had walked among them, and they had pushed him off the boat without a second glance. Not because he was disrespectful, not because he was suspicious, but because he didn't dress like authority, because his silence was misunderstood, because his calm, instead of commanding respect, had been mistaken for insignificance. Now the name hung heavy in the air, a name that had once been spoken with reverence inside briefing rooms sealed to the public. A name written in quiet ink in reports marked eyes only. A name that was never meant to be part of today's routine patrol, but had now become the reason every officer on deck stood a little straighter. The moment the truth settled in, everything changed. The officers who had dismissed him, mocked him, and pushed him off the vessel now stood in stunned silence. Their arrogance, so bold just hours earlier, had vanished like mist under the morning sun. The man they thought was just a drifter had become a storm hanging over their conscience. There were no orders coming down to reprimand them yet, no protocol breach marked in the system, but the weight of what they'd done hung heavier than any disciplinary report ever could. The senior officer walked down the dock slowly, holding the ID card with both hands now, like it might burn if mishandled. The man was still there, sitting quietly with his hands resting on his knees, looking out over the water like nothing had happened. Not angry, not smug, just still. That stillness now terrified them more than any outburst would have. It wasn't apathy, it was discipline. The kind that came from years of being trained to stay calm under fire, to suppress emotion when the mission demanded silence. The senior officer stopped a few feet away, cleared his throat. Words didn't come. How do you apologize to someone who had risked their life in places you've only read about in redacted reports? How do you speak to someone whose name was once whispered in elite training briefings only to treat him like a trespasser because you didn't bother to ask a simple question? He offered the ID back, hand slightly trembling. "Sir, I didn't know," he finally said. But it sounded weak. The words barely carried past the breeze. The man took the ID without comment, slid it back into his jacket, and looked up at the officer. That one glance spoke more than a lecture. It wasn't filled with pride or vengeance, it was just tired. The tiredness of a man who had been through too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Behind them, the rest of the crew had begun to gather, some trying to look busy, others openly watching. No one laughed now. No one dared. Even the loudest of the group, the one who had joked about dock squatters, stood rigid with his hands behind his back, shame painted across his face. Every one of them had received training in chain of command, in recognizing service status, in treating all individuals with dignity, but none of that training had mattered earlier. It had been overruled by assumption. The commanding officer walked back up the gangplank, called the crew to attention, and gave the order no one expected: invite him back aboard. Not for a formality. Not for protocol. But out of respect. Not because the manual demanded it, but because something deeper did. The order was carried out in silence. One of the younger crew members approached him, hat in hand, voice low. "We'd be honored if you came back, sir." There was a long pause. The man stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, and looked at the patrol boat. He didn't answer immediately, as if weighing whether this moment even mattered to him anymore. Eventually, he gave a small nod. No speech, no self-importance, just a nod. That was all it took to send a wave of unease through the crew, not because of fear, but because of how different he was from everything they thought a hero looked like. When he stepped back aboard, the atmosphere shifted. The deck, once filled with casual arrogance and routine, now felt sacred. Even the way he walked was different, quiet steps, deliberate and confident, like someone who knew the structure of a boat better than its designers. One of the mechanics recognized a scar on his hand, the same type he once saw on a bomb disposal diver who had served 2 tours underwater. He whispered this to the man next to him, and the rumor turned into silent acknowledgement. Nobody wanted to meet his eyes, and yet everyone did. They wanted to apologize, but words felt too small now. Everything they had assumed about authority, appearance, and value was unraveling in the presence of someone who never asked to be seen, but had now become unforgettable. Some tried to find small ways to make it right. Offering coffee, standing aside, calling him sir even though he hadn't asked for it. But nothing they did could erase the fact that they had once shoved him away like he didn't matter, and now were left trying to find dignity in the echoes of their own regret. The boat rocked gently beneath their feet as the quiet man stood once more on the deck, this time not as a suspect, not as a stranger, but as a living reminder of everything they had failed to see. He didn't speak, didn't lecture, didn't raise his voice. But in that silence, there was a weight no one could ignore. The same officers who had laughed and pushed him off were now avoiding his gaze, their uniforms suddenly feeling too light, their titles too thin to shield them from the guilt pressing down on their shoulders. They had been trained to enforce rules, to secure borders, to act decisively. But in their eagerness to follow routine, they had forgotten something more fundamental. Judgment is not just about protocol. It's about perception. About understanding that not every hero walks with medals on their chest or stripes on their sleeve. Some carry their legacy quietly in scars and silence, with nothing but a name that echoes through rooms most of them will never be invited into. The quiet man had proven that. Without saying a word, he had turned their world upside down. He had forced them to reckon with their own biases, how quickly they had reduced a man to a threat based on how he looked, not who he was. How easily they had confused calm for weakness and humility for irrelevance. They had been so focused on appearances that they missed the substance standing right in front of them. It wasn't just about the man anymore. It was about all the others like him, those who had served, who had sacrificed, and who had walked away without asking for recognition. How many of them had been ignored, mistreated, dismissed simply because they didn't wear their stories on their sleeve? How many had been forced to prove themselves over and over again, long after their service had ended, just to be treated with the dignity they'd already earned? The patrol boat crew began to see it clearly now. Respect isn't something you give based on what you see in a single moment. It's something you extend by default because you never truly know who's standing in front of you. The man had never demanded respect, but he deserved it long before anyone asked his name. That realization stung the most. Not because it hurt their pride, but because it exposed a blind spot they didn't know they had. From the bridge to the engine room, the story spread like wildfire. Not just among that crew, but to other vessels, other ports. Officers began checking themselves more carefully, asking questions before making assumptions, looking twice before passing judgment. The incident became an unofficial case study shared in briefings and training sessions, not because it was in the manual, but because it wasn't. Because it should have been. And still, through it all, the man remained unchanged. He accepted no special treatment. He gave no interviews. He left the boat with the same quiet dignity he had arrived with, disappearing into the horizon like he had done 100 times before. But his presence lingered, not in the form of glory or recognition, but in reflection, in the way they now paused before acting, in the conversations they began having with themselves, with each other. What they learned that day wasn't about rank or power. It wasn't about punishment or redemption. It was about something deeper, an understanding that true worth isn't always visible, that the world is full of people carrying histories we'll never fully comprehend, that respect should be the starting point, not the reward. Because for every quiet man like him, there are hundreds more. Men and women who have given more than most could imagine, and who ask for nothing in return. They had nearly missed the chance to honor one of them. And now that they knew, they couldn't unsee it. It became part of them, etched into the way they held their post, the way they approached strangers, the way they wore their own uniforms. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Not for what he had done, but for who he had always been, even when they refused to look.